Welcome to all on a Saturday. Here at Tuscaloosa, it is raining. The hurricane is keeping some folks away who wanted to be here. There's a giant football game happening here, which might affect things, but I'm so glad to have all of you here for this NAASR sponsored conversation. I'm Miranda Simmons. I teach at the University of Alabama, for those of you who don't know me. And Craig Martin is the president of NAASR. In my role as VP, I plan programming and events. So that's why I'm the one talking right now. But Craig's going to help me with Q&A because I don't trust myself to catch everything. So we'll tag team to make that more efficient. So just, of course, raise hand functions, questions in chat, whatever works for you. Okay, so real quickly, I'm just going to tell you what we're up to and who these fine people are if you don't know them already, and then let them take it away. Many of you know NAASR is trying to foster some interdisciplinary discussions that showcase the interesting things happening in other fields and think about them in relation to religious studies with the kinds of engagements that we can make. So we have a program in November in person that's going to demonstrate that. We're going to try to create more of these opportunities outside of that meeting. So I'm really excited about today's event. Many of us already know Donovan Schaefer, or at least his work. I met Chris when we were both part of a small working group organized by a mutual colleague and friend around the question of whether memes can think. It was the kind of discussion that reminds you just how fun this profession can be. And I think we all could use a little bit more of that these days. So Donovan and Chris are both as generous as they are generative, and I am so happy to have them in conversation and that they're willing to share that with us around Chris's new book. So Christopher Breu is the professor of English at Illinois State University, a professor of English at Illinois State, where he teaches courses in contemporary contemporary literature and culture, critical and cultural theory, and gender and sexuality. He's the author of Insistence of the Material, Literature in the Age of Biopolitics, and Hard-Boiled Masculinities. He's the co-editor of Noir Affect and has edited special journal issues on materialisms and infrastructuralism, both of which we're going to are going to make cameos in our November meeting. So you might get invoked there too, Chris. But his new book with Fordham, In Defense of Sex, Non-Binary Embodiment and Desire, promises to be an important intervention in studies of gender and sexuality, and as such is something that I think academic studies of religion need to think and talk about as well. Donovan Schaefer is professor of religious studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he's also core faculty in the program in gender, sexuality, and women's studies. He's a member of the graduate group in comparative literature, and his research focuses on the role of embodiment and feeling in religion, science, material culture, and formations of the secular. He's author of several books, including Religious Affects, Animality, Evolution and Power, The Evolution of Affect Theory, The Humanities, Sciences, and Study of Power, and the multiple award-winning, I do believe, Wild Experiment, Feeling Science and Secularism After Darwin. So thank you both in advance for having this conversation. I'm just so delighted. And take it away, Donovan.
Yeah, thanks so much, Miranda, for that introduction, and to both you and Craig for making this event happen. Chris and I have been friends online for many years, and actually only just met in person for the first time earlier this year. And I don't know. I mean, it's so easy to kind of like dismiss social media or to look down on it and to to say that it's not real or that the connections don't matter. But I've always felt this really strong connection with Chris. We've always had these really great interactions online. And then when we met for the first time earlier this year, I think that we both really felt this deep emotional connection that I think we had been building for many years. So any opportunity that I have to be in conversation with Chris is something I'm going to be excited about. So I'm really grateful to NAASR for putting this on and to Chris for coming along for this conversation. I really am a fan these days of really just trying to create what I think of as the kind of ideal seminar format where everybody is just sitting around having a conversation. And so as I understand it, Marinda, what you'd like to do is to have a kind of back and forth for a little while. And then at some point, we're going to shift gears. And I really think that we should lean into the fact that we're a smallish group today. And I don't know about where all you are, but it's rainy here in Philadelphia. And just lean into the kind of fireside chat aspect of this. That said, we were also talking, Chris's book has only really just been published and is so fresh that Chris himself does not have a copy, and I don't have a copy. I read a digital copy to kind of wrap my head around this. So what I thought we would do is have a kind of on-ramp to the book where Chris and I will talk a little bit about Chris's background and just the kind of intellectual sort of backdrop that this book came out of, and then go from there into really kind of trying to unearth some of the insights that I think are in this book. I'm really working from the assumption here that nobody in this room has read this book. And if I'm mistaken about this and you know this book inside and out, I apologize. But to me, that's also just part of creating the conversational atmosphere that I think will serve us well once we sort of shift gears into the more kind of open conversational format. So Chris, I wondered if you could start by talking not about this book, but talking about your background and in particular, your kind of research trajectory and maybe some of the previous books and major projects that you've completed, just to kind of give everyone in the room, some of whom may not know your work, a kind of clearer picture of your research profile.
Absolutely. First, I just want to thank everybody. I want to thank Donovan. It's so great to be in conversation. I feel exactly the same way. Like there's a way in which when we met in person, it just confirmed the fact that we totally were, connected. And I want to thank Craig and Marinda for putting this together and for inviting me to talk to you all. I'm really excited about putting this book and its argument into dialogue with religious studies. I mean, it's also, I should admit straight up that it's a field I do not know well. Although Fordham is actually one of the presses that's been publishing, I know, really interesting work in religious studies. So working with them, I've actually started to read, book titles and read backs of books and order a couple things and stuff. But it's still not, I still am not, I have no real expertise in the area. So I'm really looking forward to you all for teaching me what I can draw from religious studies and how I can rethink what I'm doing in relationship to the framework of religious studies. So thank you all, and thank you all for coming out on I actually love the size of this. This is great. So thank you for coming out, on a Saturday. It's hard to get me like out of the chair on Saturday, so I admire people actually doing this. But anyway, yeah, let me talk about my background. I got my PhD from UC Santa Cruz, which was sort of a theory hotbed in the 90s. It's where history of consciousness was, although I wasn't in that program. I was in the less prestigious literature program, but we did take classes in history of consciousness periodically. But my first book, interestingly, all my books in some ways are both trying to engage something I think is really important on a social level. That like a lot of scholars, I think in both our fields, there's a political dimension, to the work that I do, and I want to engage political, economic questions, ecological questions, questions of issues of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia in this current book. But I'm always interested also in thinking about subjectivity, which of course it is itself linked to to all those political categories. But my work is always both going outwards, but there's always a personal or a subjective element to my work. There's something I'm trying to work out that isn't just scholarly. It's also something I'm trying to work through. I won't dwell on my background. Partly what the current book is arguing is that we can't get so caught up in our identifications that we can't learn to speak to each other and find ways of recognizing that in fact most people are dealing with all kinds of things that we don't always see, and that we need to find modes of collective organizing that allow us to work together in solidarity. So that if we get too auto-focused, that some of that can break down, and I'll talk about that. But anyway, all three of my monographs were actually trying to work out something personal as well as political. And in the first case, it was, personal is almost the wrong word, subjective, it might be a better word. In the first case, it was my first book, Hard-Boiled Masculinities. It was the idea of male toughness and the sort of fantasy of the aggressive male that was, present in both what I saw present both in pulp fiction of the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and I did some research in the pulp magazine archives. But I also saw it picked up in modernist novels by people like Hemingway and Faulkner, and so I looked at detective fiction by Dashiell Hammett and Chester Himes, and then also Hemingway and Faulkner, and a bunch of forgotten and stories from the pulp magazine archives that are at the Charles Young Library at UCLA. But in that book, I was actually trying to combine Marxism and psychoanalysis to look at this figure of the hard-boiled male, the sort of tough guy who tries to imagine a kind of shell-like exterior, and that can repel any idea of penetration. A lot of straight masculinity of the period, and all the way up to the MAGA folks today, among other things. There's a kind of discourse of a fear of penetration, right? A fear of and a fear of showing emotions, other than that's maybe shifted in a certain way, but but yeah, that book, in some ways, I never felt comfortable with masculinity. It's never been something I'm fully comfortable with, even as I also clearly identify with it on some level too. And I grew up with a father who was both like the most sensitive character on the planet, and also always was gruff and tough, and was against crying and all these other things. And so I was trying to work through the masculinity I inherited. And my dad's a wonderful person. I don't mean to. I'm not trying to throw him under the bus or anything here, but we all inherit these things. I mean, and so that was the first book. The second book, Insistence of the Material, and that one really links up with the current book, and I'll talk about that. But in Insistence of the Material, like a lot of people right around the same time, I had become really frustrated with the post-structuralist emphasis on language as being, that which constitutes reality, what people call the linguistic turn. For me, as much as I loved people like Judith Butler and Foucault, Derrida, although I never loved Derrida as much, I got to say. I often became frustrated that the question of materiality always seemed to fall out, that it seemed to disappear, that language became, the only access to the material was through representation and language. And I accept that, but that doesn't mean we can't theorize the material at the same time. And I felt like the exclusion of the material created all kinds of political problems, not being able to theorize ecology the way we need to. The climate emergency is not just a construction. It's a reality of what's happening to the climate. How do we think about embodiment? It's not just about signification. It's not even just as much as a psychoanalytic scholar as I am. It's not either about symptoms just shaping the body. That the body also is, as feminist new materialists argue, the body is also agental. It actually responds to the significations that play across its surface, and it responds, and that there's a materiality to it, the materiality of the built environment, the materiality of the political economy. We like to think of the political economy a lot these days in the global north in terms of finance, and in terms of digits going moving rapidly on computer screens. But there's so many material dimensions of the economy too, even in our present moment of so-called post-Fordist production or contemporary post-industrial production. Industrialism may not be happening as much it may not be as visible in the first world, but it's everywhere still. I mean, the supply chain crisis demonstrated that. But there was also something that that was more personal again, or more subjective, that that book was about, which was that I was born with an embodiment that is intersex, and I was born with what's called a severe case of hypospadias. Hypospadias is where the urethra doesn't go all the way out to the tip of the penis, and so. And I had my parents were advised, like a lot of people have been advised in the last 50 years, or sorry, 70 years, since they started really kind of regularly doing surgeries on intersex kids, and in the name of fixing them and making them normal, so that they wouldn't be teased by their peers, so the parents felt comfortable with them, which I think is a fascinating construction, and so that we could have children if we wanted to, which I've never wanted. And, but anyway, I had an initial surgery, and like a lot of people who had these surgeries, it's gotten better in the last, like 10 to 15 years or so. But many of the people who had it in the 20th century, the initial surgery produced all kinds of complications. It produced strictures, urinary tract strictures, and I kept having to have surgery after surgery. As far as I can tell, it's around 16 surgeries that I went through between two and the last one was about 6 years ago. But one of the interesting things, and I didn't even realize this, was that, and I don't mean to go on and on about this. I want to get back to the book, but which is all about this stuff. So. But one of the things that I didn't realize until I had a relatively progressive doctor at San Francisco, who was one of the leading urologists, and was influenced by the sort of like nicely less repressed sex culture in San Francisco. He's like, he'd taken everything down because he said your reconstructed urethra was a complete mess. And he took everything down, and he's like, we don't have to rebuild it. You could just leave it as is. He goes, I have all these bikers that come in and they get injured. And I never knew that this was such a biker injury, but they get injured and their urethra would be cut, and they're like, yeah, just leave me this way. Clean it up, but just leave me this way. I just sit down to pee. There's no, I mean, 60%, or more than 50% of the population does that, like, so, and so, I was like, oh my God, you mean I don't have to have this reconstructed? I had no idea. And so I that's the way my body's been. Still, there's some scar tissue that still forms because of the instrumentation. But it really was one of the most sort of life-saving choices I made. And it allowed me to what was I going to say? Yeah, life affirming. I would almost say choices I made, and it allowed me to not have these. The surgeries became much less regular, and I felt like I was finally able to step away from that trauma to a certain degree. But the insight that informed insistence of the material, and I was looking at how the representation of materiality in a range of literary texts, from William Burroughs all the way through Leslie Marmon Silko and the new narrative writer. Dodie Bellamy, who I'm a huge fan of. But the insight that was central to that book, and that's still functioning in the current book, is that I wanted to theorize materiality as agental, as something that resists the cultural codings that get put on it, because my body did that. It kept resisting the gendering that was getting inscribed on it. It kept resisting the sexing, I would actually argue, that was getting inscribed on it. And so I started with a preface about my surgeries in that book, and then the rest of it was about literature and theory and rethinking late 20th century culture and rethinking so-called postmodern texts as not just about language play, but actually about material systems and material entities, that they're actually obsessed with it. Like, materiality is all over people like Pynchon or Ballard, two other people I talk about, or Bellamy or Silko. So, and so that was that book, and that became sort of like the moment where I was like, materialism, and not just cultural materialism, is really my thing. That's my jam. And so I kept working in that. I also lost a partner to ALS in 2017, Elizabeth Hatmaker, brilliant poet, beautiful person, wonderfully dark and fascinating poet. We were both noir fans, and so we were editing Noir Affect together. And that one's about ugly emotions. That's actually about, I really admire and know Donovan's work on affect. One of the things I wanted to emphasize that noir is less about like a cycle of films or a cycle of novels, although it is about that as well. But it's both a more global form than people talk about it. But what I see as defining noir, and this is something Elizabeth and I worked out together, is affects that are negative affects, things like rage, sadness, jealousy, suicidal ideation, murderousness, covetousness, and that the best noirs foregrounded those negative emotions and made you sit with them. And the thing that was always so disturbing about noir was it didn't give you a kind of like Adornian distance from its characters. Instead, it was about an aesthetics of proximity. And one of the things that Lacan argues is that anxiety is all about being proximate to an object that disturbs you, to the object on a certain level. And so I would argue that noir does that in spades when it's done really well. Anyway, this new book is funny because it came around completely by accident at first, I was invited to give a talk by Julietta Singh and Nathan Snazza, Nathan Snazza. And I know Donovan Nathan's coming to speak for you all right soon. They actually said, we love the preface to Insistence of the Material. We want you to do some more stuff on intersex. I had also written like a short piece for NCT, no, it's not NCT. I think it's English Teacher is the journal, but I had done a short piece. First thing I wrote about intersex. I wrote the preface for Insistence of the Material. Both times it was so hard to write and read about this stuff. It just hurt my head. It was really, really, I was like, I don't want to fucking write about this anymore. And they invited me to write. But all of a sudden I discovered I still, and I was like, I also don't want to be pigeonholed as the intersex person, right? I mean, that's an important part of my life, and I don't, and who I am. But I don't want to like make, there's a lot of other things, I'm a theory head, I'm an intellectual, I'm a, all kinds of things. I'm a crazy music fan, and I wanted that, I'm a literature and cultural studies scholar, and I didn't want that to eclipse all the rest of this. But then I started writing about it, and I was like, you know what? I still have a lot to say here. And it got much easier to write too. I started reading more and doing that work. And one of the things that had always, and now I'm going to shift to the new book. One of the things that had always stayed with me, and I talk about this in the preface, was I remember reading Judith Butler when I was this, sort of long-haired grad student back when I had hair, I remember reading on a 10-hour bus ride to Los Angeles from Santa Cruz, where I was visiting my friend Valerie, I needed almost all 10 hours of that to get through Gender Trouble, even though it's like only 180 pages or whatever it is. I remember thinking that Butler was so affirming to me in the ways in which she undid gender and undid gender binaries, and all of a sudden, what was presented to me as an absolutely natural binary choice stopped all of a sudden seeming like one. But the thing that, of course, Butler got this critique from a lot of other people. There's that famous passage in Bodies That Matter where she says, what about the body, Judy? Right? And that's what people kept saying to her. And she got, anyway, I won't go into that whole story, but, and I shared that frustration too. I was like, I'm absolutely with you about deconstructing the binary here, but we also still need to talk about material sex. Intersex is illegible without talking about material sex. And so how do we have a politics, and this is what this book became, how do we have a politics that can think about sex in ways that don't just reproduce transphobic rhetorics that invoke sex as a way of delegitimizing transgender, trans identifications. And by the way, I'm going to use identification, not identity. That's actually really important for me. I think we identify rather than have identities, and actually we're split subjects in various ways. I'm enough of a psychoanalytic, I can't think of the right word, but anyway, I'm enough of a psychoanalytic thinker that's the way I want to think about that, and I'll talk more about that when we talk about different chapters. But anyway, I was like, but sex is only transphobic if it actually is binary. And if it's constructed as the bedrock of gender, right? I mean, we could talk about it as binary without even talking about it as and still not talking about it as the bedrock of gender. But I didn't want to do that. The way I saw it, and because there's a whole range of intersex embodiments. A friend of mine, a really well-known scholar, I'm not going to name her because even though she just found out she was intersex at the age of 40 when she had a surgery, a hernia surgery just now. Famous queer scholar, always embodied a kind of butch subjectivity, and she was, we were actually messaging at like 1 a.m. last night because I was woken up by a big storm here, and I was like, hey, if you need to talk, just don't hesitate to reach out. But sex is actually much more like a spectrum, like gender can be too. And that's part of the argument of this book and how to theorize embodiment in relationship to that. The other thing that this book is also a response to is that Santa Cruz and the West Coast were really affirming for me. I was this, Chicago kid who grew up with very sexually repressed parents. I know Foucault would argue that the sexual hypothesis or the repressive hypothesis, is a myth, but it certainly has local embodiments, even if it's a larger historiographical myth. And we can talk about that. I'm not fully buying that either. Although, I mean, Foucault's amazing. But anyway, and I'll stop after this. But I also wanted to, it's funny because when I first was presenting the piece at Richmond, where Julietta and Nathan were, one of the things I said was, I bet you thought I was going to talk about fucking. Well, I'm not talking about fucking, because the piece was named In the Defense of Sex, and then later I was like, well, why am I not also talking about fucking? If I'm going to defend sex, why not talk about fucking too? And one of the things that really helped me when I was on the West Coast was the sex positive culture out there. It really helped me. I have an intense amount of guilt around sex and my embodiment, even now, even as I know rationally, and even as I have a happy sex life, as I buddies with all kinds of cool pro queer friends and pro kink friends and stuff like that. There's still always this kind of irrational guilt tied around it. And so one of the things I just was noticing that pro-sex moment in the 90s, which had its own problems, there was a kind of libertarian edge to it that was not great, at points. But that had really disappeared, and that there's a way in which in the present, the discourses about sex as I see them in the present is that sex is both ubiquitous and everybody feels threatened by it. And it's ubiquitously a problem that sex is being narrated almost all the time as something negative. It's an imposition on us. We get sexualized without our consent by the culture. Which psychoanalytically is true on a certain level. Sex does come from the outside if you buy Laplanche and Lacan, and then becomes what Lacan would call extimate, a kind of intimate exteriority or an interiorized exteriority, intimate exteriority or exteriorized intimacy. That's what I meant. And so I was like, why not engage that too? And so the book talks about non-binary embodiment. It defends sex in terms of non-binary embodiment. It also argues that sex itself, and I'm trying to be respectful of the asexual movement, among other things. I have a really good colleague here, Ella Shabilo, who's like one of the leading asexual scholars, and we have really rich disagreements that also are agreements most of the time. And I mean, I love her as a colleague. At the same time, I think one of the things we've lost in saying that sex is something that's both conscriptive and that we should, and of course we should all be able to opt out of it. But if you're being asexual, there's still a way in which you're defining yourself in relationship to sex on a certain level. And so the other thing about sex is that I would argue that it's a building block of the social, and we've forgotten that sex isn't just negative, or it isn't just about transgression or pleasure. Although it's it can be about all those things, and it often is really fun when it's about a number of those things. But it's also actually the motive force, and here I'm very Marcusean in a certain sense. It's the motive force by which we construct cultural connections. And because I see one of the effects of neoliberalism, and Donovan and I will probably go back and forth around neoliberalism today, but one of the effects of neoliberalism is a kind of atomization of the social. And I think the sort of turn away from sex, seeing it only as a problem, is a symptom of that. So that's the book. There's also a discussion of, and I'll get into it later, but there's a discussion of the category of flesh that's been really generative in African American studies and Black studies more generally, actually, like thinking of the many Caribbean writers, they're borrowing from Sylvia Wynter, among other people, and Wahilier, Alexander Wahilier, and all the way up through Marquise Bay and R.A. Judy's and C. Riley Snorton's work, which is fantastic. But there's a way in which gender, I wanted to argue that we need sex, not only because we need to theorize intersex embodiment, but also gender is often conflated and equated with whiteness. And there's a way in which bodies of color, and especially Black bodies, are historically were equated with this category of flesh that Hortense Spillers theorizes, and that was degendered for her. And so without a theory of sex and flesh, there's also a way in which gender becomes way too much about a kind of middle-class white ideal. And so that's another dimension to the book. But anyway, I talk forever, sorry about that, but you asked a big question, I gave you a big answer. So
Yeah, great. That's really wonderful. I love the way that you're a literature guy, and you can see this sort of literary sensibility and how your overarching research trajectory makes a kind of continuous plot line. Is it a noir plot line? That would be interesting to hear.
That's an interesting question. I've been
Here's
publishing.
what I wanted to ask you, though. I mean, I was just so kind of in the mode of summarizing the book. There's a passage in the book that really jumped out at me as something that I think crystallized a lot of the different arguments that you make in the book, that sort of serves as a kind of, you talk a lot about this image of the knot, Lacan's Borromean knot. And this passage to me was a kind of Borromean knot of the book. So I wanted to read this out and just get you to maybe talk about how it fits into the book as a whole. You write, "It is important, employing the materialism mixed with soft constructionism that I am advocating, that we neither reify sex into a fixed entity of positivist science, nor theorize it away by pointing to the malleability of its various discursive meanings. Recognizing the partial constructedness of sex as a category does not mean that we need to treat it as flexibly as gender. It does not mean that strong constructionism was right all along, and that we should see sex like gender as a product of discourse, and as such, open to radical historical contingency and performative resignification. This is one road to take in approaching sex, but there is another one. It is the materialist road, which posits sex, like flesh, as that which exists in tension with human cultural scripts and refuses plasticity, encodes wounds, and exists where gendered ideologies come undone and racialized and sexed ones become enacted. Like Hedwig's angry inch in the play and film of the same name, sex is what remains from the manipulations and transformations of biomedicalized gender. It insists angrily on a reckoning." What do you think? Am I right to hold this up as a kind of sort of miniature manifesto of the book as a whole?
Absolutely. And I think that's I think that's one of those methodological moments where I'm sort of finally laying my cards fully on the table there. So, and yeah, I think that's I'm unsurprised that you're as always a really astute, close reader. So, but yeah, I think it is, I think that is one of the really sort of central, like knots of the book. And again, part of this was that one of the things I want to resist is the idea, and this I also link this to sort of avatar culture and to the growth of image culture and the growth of like our kind of algorithmic lives online and stuff. But one of the things that I worry about when we think everything is purely construction based, constructive, is that we imagine that there's no weight, there's no resistance, there's no ballast. I think that's I can't remember who. I think Susan Heckman coined that term, ballast. Again, I want to think about the body not as fixed, but as working by its own temporalities, its own materialities, its own scripts that are both intimate and alien. And in doing that, I don't want to say that I'm not trying to do a Cartesian move of separating mind and body. What I am saying, though, is that we can't collapse the two absolutely either. That we have our maps of the body, and I would call them imaginary maps in a Lacanian register. But there's also aspects of the body that elude both our symbolic and imaginary constructions of them, and I would call that the real of the body on a certain level. But and that that we need to attend to the materiality of the body, and some of this is especially in a moment where in fact we're starting to see the limits of what human construction can do on a certain level in culture. I mean, we have. I mean, capitalism is all about producing a kind of logic that covers over our relationship to ecosystems and imagines that growth and exchange can just get ever and ever bigger. And yet. There are finite, they're not simple finite limits, but there are material limits that are affected by growth and that are affected by these other things. You can actually maybe come up with some scientific advances that might change those limits. I'm not saying the limits are hard and fast, but one of the things I think that actually the whole anti-foundationalist project of theory, as much as I'm invested in it, and this is a really big claim, and maybe I'm walking into one here, but one of the things that always bugged me was its refusal of dealing with limits, of the limits of embodiment, the limits of the material in various ways, the ways in which materiality takes on a force and weight. One of the versions of there's the materiality and new materialism, which is one version of force and weight. The materiality of our bodies, of the ecosystems we function within, of the what Stacy Alimo calls transcorporeality. And Stacy's been great. She's been one of my great interlocutors in this project. But and there's a what Marx called the sort of setting of creating of possibilities and limits that any moment of the capitalist world system has. And so the idea that we can just construct things through language and discourse, and that power is and change are always embodied only in discourse, finally feels as it feels, I won't call it idealist, but it doesn't feel materialist enough, if that makes sense. At the same time, I don't want to reproduce, the kind of transphobic discourses around gender that say, well, these aren't natural, or these aren't material, these reconstructions. I mean, actually, gender is radically material. It's just a different kind of materiality than sex. So yeah.
That's great. That leads really beautifully into my next question. I mean, one of the things that I find so exciting about engaging you, just as a thinker in general, but especially when I'm reading your work, is how self-reflexive you are about the theoretical frames that you're bringing to bear. And I think that this kind of hybrid audience of sort of people from around the humanities, and NAASR in particular as an institution, I think of as an organization that is especially interested in self-reflexive uses of theory. And I really see that as something that you take incredibly seriously in all the work that you do. So, I mean, when I was reading this book in particular, I was thinking, you've got a kind of Marxist sort of base, and then you've also got these kind of maybe it's like a kind of psychoanalytic I don't know, flair to it, but then there's also all of this new materialism, and it's blended together, and you're very self-conscious about the way that you are bringing these different theoretical frames into conversation with each other, what they're doing for you, but also what they're not doing for you, and where you see them as kind of like addressing, redressing, correcting each other. There's this really interesting dynamic, and this, I think, speaks very organically to what you were just talking about. that I picked up on while I was reading this, between a kind of imperative to theorize something like structure
Mhm.
and an imperative to theorize something like anti-structure or something like improvisation.
Mhm.
So you've got a great passage in your preface. You say, from the contemporary vantage, social planning looks like a lost art, one we need to renew. We need planning. We also need play and improvisation. The best social visions and the best art, take jazz and other improvised music, for example, combine these two approaches. And I felt like this was a motif of the book, and the way that you're summarizing it now is really, I think, amplifying this point that one of the main concerns about this book is ways that other registers of theory in the humanities have actually missed the way that materiality defines forms of constraint, the way that it defines forms of opposition, the way that it defines form of limitation.
Mhm.
So I'm not gonna overdo it with reading excerpts from the book, although I will say it's a very beautiful book. It's very quotable, and I'd love to, if we have time, I'll ask you about your style in this later as well.
Thank you.
Um,
That means a lot
but
to
I
me.
wanted
Well,
but I wanted to read another passage that I think sort of speaks to this point. You write, while I do not want to re-binarize gender, I do want to interrogate what happens when it becomes so plural, so individually determined, so micro-political that it seems to elude larger ideological structures and formations. On one level, maybe it has begun to outstrip the grip of ideology, and certainly I want to affirm the utopian currents at work in various redefinitions, appropriations, and rearticulations of gender. Marquis Bay has articulated some of these positive currents in arguing for the abolition of gender. While I want to affirm utopian possibilities attaching to rethinking or thinking beyond gender, and I share Bay's desire to move beyond identitarian logics, it also strikes me as idealist or voluntarist to imagine that we can simply abolish gender or shatter it in relationship to a conception of Deleuzian becomings. Abstractions, particularly the ones we use for designating forms of difference and hierarchy, need to be undone on material levels, and not just on the level of language or identification. As Louis Althusser has taught us, it is precisely when something seems outside of ideology that we need to interrogate its ideological coordinates.
Mhm.
So I love passages like this. I find this really gets me kind of resonating. It's the kind of thing that I just want to kind of spend time with and turn over in my head. But what I wanted to ask you is if you could maybe use this passage as a lens to draw out some of the self-reflection that you are doing in this book in terms of your relationship to theory as a whole. How do you see this book fitting into broader landscapes of conversation in what you understand as theory today? How do you see it as drafting in the wake of those conversations, but also how do you see it as pushing back?
Mm. Nice. That's an excellent question. I think, in some ways it's almost like a little anachronistic. It's a book that's doing a kind of big theoretical project that's drawing on, theories that we tend to associate with modernity, like, or modernism, like psychoanalysis and Marxism. I've always had a deep commitment to both, and I could talk about why at some point. But one of the things I'm really invested in is because it's both. Contradiction is always central to both, and I really think that we need to think about contradiction in thinking about the social. The idea that there are just a simple positive or negative to something, rather than things existing in contradiction, seems to me to be one of the problems when when we reduce everything to the idea of just discursive inscription. And again, I mean, discourse is also a really complex and rich category. I'm not trying to, I mean, Foucault has been very influential to me. I don't want to, dismiss it, but I do want to think about what sets limits on representation, what sets limits on discourse. One of the things I think is most fascinating with Marxism and psychoanalysis, it's that which is not represented that is most determining. It's that which actually seems to elude. I mean, it's a version of the real and Lacan, right? It's the thing that you can't represent directly, but you find the effects of it everywhere by the way in which it warps or distorts representation or signification. And so that's one part of the, and I've always had an investment in both of those fields, because I think that it actually, especially psychoanalysis for me, produces a kind of reflexive mode. Even, I mean, there's a million issues you could take with psychoanalysis, but for me, theory is less about its surface politics, and it's more about what it enables on a kind of like a structural level. And so psychoanalysis always, what I'm always interested in, and it actually, this really links to your work, Donovan. I'm interested in the ways in which whenever we try and produce a model, or whenever we try and think theoretically, or whenever we want to try to understand the social, there's always distortions there. And those distortions are produced by the unconscious. They're produced by our own position. I mean, this is where Marxism is important too. They're produced by our own positionality within the society, even as I don't think we want to think that we can be reduced to that positionality too. This is also, I mean, and so part of what I wanted to write here, and this is actually something I share with, one of my closest interlocutors, intellectual interlocutors, Anna Kornblue, whose own immediacy is doing this work right now, and is stirring up all kinds of things in various directions, but which I'm really happy about. I think, I mean, like her, I think I'm going to be freaked out if to see how people react to my book. But anyway, if it doesn't just wind up like, sinking like a stone, like these things do sometimes. But anyway, one of the things she's been really critical of is the growth of things like auto theory and auto fiction. The emphasis on the personal, that theory can just account for the subjective or the personal, and that it doesn't need to theorize outside of that. Certainly auto theory and auto fiction can do really powerful things. I mean, memoirs, I was teaching, I teach a number of memoirs when I teach literature, but it is interesting the ways in which fiction seems to be less the dominant medium now, and instead the memoir has really emerged as the dominant medium. And what's the thing about fiction? It imagines a relationship to otherness. It imagines, and I mean, certainly auto theory can, or I mean auto fiction can too, but it imagines a relationship to otherness. It also tries to map the social on some level or another, however experimental it is. And so theory to me has to do the same. And so one of the things I'm trying to push back against is the idea, and you see this on social media a lot. And you and I, you and I were talking about this before, but this book is a response to certain social media discourses as much as anything else, and that may be some of its limitation. But to come back, but part of what I see a lot on social media, and this is supposed to be a progressive discourse, is you can't speak to this unless you've experienced it, right? And I'm like, if that's really true, then we can't speak to each other at all. And if that's really true, and I'm not saying that experience doesn't matter, it absolutely does. It shapes who we are, but it does not fix who we are. And that's a really important distinction to me. And the impulse, the ethical impulse to not speak for other people, I actually think has really become destructive on the left. We have no ability to imagine larger forms of coalitional politics. That, to me, theory at its best actually took on big problems and took risks. And if I didn't do a good job representing something, come at me. That's great. Build off of it. But the idea of abandoning the field because it's actually ethical, I think that's actually like it actually confirms both atomization and the way in which our lives have become super privatized and super commodity driven, in which we only want things that are relatable to us coming across our screens. This is also something I have with my students all the time. If your measure of a book is relatable, then you're actually not engaging what literature is supposed to be about, which is actually understanding the position of other people, not just your position. And I think that's theory too at its best. And of course, theory has its I'm trying to not use it has its blinders. Okay. Of course, didn't want to use an ableist metaphor there, but of course, theory has its blinders. And I'm sure there are, I can always see my own blinders and my own personality in my books in all kinds of ways. And I'm like, ugh. There's always that moment of ugh. Okay, this is you're still writing. I mean, we all write with an unconscious, if you believe we all have unconscious, and that shows up in our work. But that's generative rather than finally limiting. It's also about that play, as you talk about, between between contingency on the one hand and structure on the other. That part of what we need to do with work is take the risk of opening up, take the risk of engaging other people and other places and other thoughts. This book it was really scary for me to write, and it's actually even scarier now it's coming out on a certain level, although I also couldn't stop writing it, so there's something to that. But it feels like both a maybe overly bold book, which is a problem, but it's also very vulnerable. I'm basically putting my sexuality and my embodiment on the page, for the whole thing. And so so I think I hope that's a good answer to your question, but I actually think,
Sure.
okay, yeah, okay, I'll leave it there then.
Sure. I was just going to say, I mean, it also really nicely sets up the next question, which I wanted to ask, which is, I'm going to say this. It might sound like a criticism, but it's not. It's actually a compliment. This book feels very online to me. And as, like I'm a very online guy, you're a very online guy. We, interact a lot in this online space. And this book feels to me like something that is in a kind of constant contact with this online space. Like you're talking about memes, you're talking about blog posts, you're talking about comments on social media. I really get this feeling, like the kids will talk about it like it's the discourse, capital D, the discourse, like is what people online are saying about a particular thing. And this to me was a very meaningful response to the discourse in a lot of ways. I really felt like one of the ways that I was kind of feeling my way through this project was that it is caught between a frustration with some iterations of contemporary theory, and on the other hand, a frustration with a kind of popular common sense, like especially a sort of crypto liberalism, like this sort of hidden individualism that is informing all of these aspects of our kind of popular common sense. And this to me is a pure strength of the book, the way that it is. It's theoretically sophisticated, it's detailed, it's robust in its engagement with academic literatures, but it also feels like something that is very 2024, very kind of like in tune with conversations that are happening around us all the time. I was also interested, I mean, even just now, like when you were sort of talking about, you were fumbling about whether or not to use the word blinders, and you were like, is that an ableist word? And that's actually a stylistic motif, a leitmotif that I found a lot in this book, where you would say things like, I don't want to be accused of saying X. But then you would say and you wouldn't say X, but then you would say something that was sort of
related to X,
but very acutely sensitive towards a particular political concern. And I think a lot about this dynamic that just the condition of being online provokes in us, where we're constantly worried, not just about the one person that we're talking to, but about the 1,000 other people that might be reading what we're saying. And, if 0.1% of that group or if 1% of that group is offended, then 10 people are offended and they're going to respond. So I was curious because it felt like such an intimate feature of this book. If you could talk about whether you see this as a book that was shaped in some way by the condition of onlineness that we all are inhabiting so intimately now.
Absolutely. That's a resounding yes. And I think part of it is that I do spend a lot of time online, I'm like your classic, academic introvert. I love hanging out with my good friends, but going out takes energy. Teaching takes an incredible amount of energy. I mean, I think it's one of the most important things we do, and I take it very seriously. But I wind up just being wrecked, afterwards. That's a personal response, and I'll get to the actual larger social context here. But yeah, I mean, and I know many of you as much through Facebook. The people I know here, I know as much through Facebook as I do through. Marinda might be the one exception, actually. As I do in person. We probably interacted more on online than in person. So yeah, it is informed by social media. It's also informed by the kind of moralistic culture that I see that is that crypto liberalism. I wouldn't even call it crypto. I call it a liberalism with like that actually shades. And we'll have the neoliberal conversation, but that shades into neoliberal ideas of punishment and moral, and ideas of human capital. Who has it? Who deserves good things and who deserves bad things, that kind of thing. And one of the ways in which I think a lot of online discussion is bad faith is the scapegoating that you see all the time. Like one person becomes the site of all this rage, right? And I'm like, how is that progressive? On any level, how is that progressive? If people feeling morally righteous about people and canceling them, and I get the right wing, is also using cancel culture and stuff like that as a term. And and they're just trying to, justify their racism and everything else. And I'm not, I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to support their critique of it, but I do think that that liberalism really inhibits larger left projects, I think. And part of part of those projects, and I think it's been really good since things like Black Lives Matter have put some of this on the table. Restorative justice, right? Restorative interactions, taking responsibility, all of those are really, I think, important. And I'm going to take a little bit of a detour and I'm going to come back to your question just really quickly. Part of what was hard to write about this book, but why I also was writing about it. Oh, one thing I didn't answer in the first question was, second book was about the body, and it produced a different relationship to the body. I went from being abstracted from my body because I would always go out of my body when I was in the hospital or on the operating table. And this book is about sex, and sex has always been almost the biggest contradiction for me. Not just my physical sex, but like how my desire was shaped by all those surgeries. And they were shaped. I mean, they produced a sexuality in a certain way. I always, it produced a lot of dark fantasies for me and a sense of guilt around those fantasies too. And so whenever I see people piling on somebody, I always identify with the person being piled on. I always identify, like I identify with the monster when I read, Frankenstein, like most of us do actually, but, and the creature, I should say, right? But I always felt monstrous because my body was, seen as non-normative, as having a birth defect. And so part of what I want to come critique is the ways in which this is actually losing allies, shutting things down, when we actually need to help people transform and grow rather than be alienated. So that's part of this as well. But anyway, the other thing about online, I actually think Facebook and online posting in general has made my prose much better. It's actually writing quickly, sort of with a kind of demotic, like a quality to it. If that there's, I'm using everyday language in Facebook. I'm writing as this Breu person, and yet I write about theory a lot. But I actually, I was so stilted and influenced by people like Jameson and Spivak as a writer, and that's I mean, I love both of them, and I'm very sad about Jameson's passing. But nobody writes like Jameson well except Jameson, and so I wanted to find a different way with this book. And one of the things I learned to do was like use declarative sentences. Write, if you're going to produce a long sentence, then produce a really short one after it. Use a kind of shifting I and we. There's been a lot of critique of the use of we sometimes, but we to me is a kind of performative of solidarity in a certain way. And you could say, I'm not actually part of that solidarity, and that's fine. But it's an offer. Whereas when I'm saying I, it's usually something more specific to me. But yeah, it really changed my writing. And, not only did I learn to write faster, and when I was first having this transformation, I was actually often toggling between whatever I was working on in Facebook to keep me from getting nervous, actually. And then it actually reshaped my writing. So absolutely, I think online culture, for better or worse, but it's actually one of the rare public spheres we have left in a certain way. It is the place where it very much influenced both the thought and the style of this book.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. Yeah, I mean, good point. Like maybe crypto liberalism is giving it even a little bit too much, giving it a little bit too much sophistication. I mean, it's much more transparent than that in some ways. I was thinking about, I find whenever I'm reading histories of revolutionary movements, the obsession of the revolutionaries in the lead up to the revolution itself is, how do we build solidarity?
Yeah.
It's how do we reach people? How do we connect people? How do we get people on our side? The sense of how do we create a kind of lean, internally pure unit it's just way in the background. Like, the goal is numbers. The goal is how do you massify the movement itself. So, I mean, that brings me to one of the other questions that I wanted to ask you, which is about this dynamic of liberalism, neoliberalism, and how we can even talk about the arguments that you make about sex in terms of a kind of periodization. So one of the points that you make in the book is you make the case that there has been a rise in what you call sex negativity, that there's actually a kind of ambient hostility to sex, both on the register of kind of like physiological sex, like the physiological properties that sexuate someone, but also in terms of having sex, in terms of like eroticism itself. And you talk about Gila Ashtor's erotophobia as part of this. So I wanted to ask you about this because this is something that you periodize in a specific way with an invocation of a kind of Marxist approach, a very 21st century Marxist approach, with specific reference to neoliberalism. So I wanted to read another passage just to kind of anchor all of us to this moment in this book. It's prevalent in the book, but one of the moments where you talk about this. You write, "More than the unintentional effects of necessary struggles around sexual violence, however, I think the roots of the reconceptualization of sex as a problem, one that traumatically sexualizes one, is more directly related to transformations in subjectivity produced by neoliberalism and the uneven mediation of much of our sense of self through the ever-changing lens of social media and online culture more generally. Central to neoliberalism, as thinkers as diverse as Foucault, Wendy Brown, and David Harvey have argued, is the notion of human capital. In place of collective notions of shared subjectivity produced by shared yet unequal access to the public sphere as a locus of collective rights and responsibilities, all of which are part of the long legacy of Fordism and the powerful forms of feminist, gay, and anti-racist struggles of the 1960s and 70s, we have instead a thoroughly individualized notion of one's relationship to the social, one that depends on how much human capital one has amassed. Human capital assumes that all aspects of human existence can be regulated and sorted by the market. In place of the society so hated by neoliberal warriors like Thatcher and Reagan as a locus of collective responsibility, positive liberty, and the possibility of collective flourishing, we instead have a collection of competing individuals whose right to social and economic goods depends on their individual performance of wealth, ability, health, morality, and visibility. In place of a social contract, however inadequate and bisected by the contradictions of capitalism, we instead have the imperative toward self-branding. You need to be on brand, as the ironic internet logo has it. So the imperative towards self-branding, because you need to be on brand, towards self-promotion, and an individualist understanding of identity as personal property. So the way that I map your argument is that you are making the case that in the online hypermediatized neoliberal social media world, a path has been taken whereby people are more likely to market their identitarian niche as a way of affirming social capital, and that this is actually sex negative, that this is actually repelling individuals away from actual embodied sex, which we could understand in all of these different ways. So I wanted to press on this with you. Personally, I will come out of the closet. I'm a neoliberalism skeptic. It's not that I don't think it's useful under certain circumstances, but I also I have a lot of confidence that it is overused. It's something I'm always, anytime that I always tell my students, like, if you're going to use the word neoliberalism, like, I need a definition. I need it like linked to a particular literature, which of course you do. But I was thinking about sex negativity in particular. And I was thinking about neoliberalism. To me, is most interesting as a kind of historical category, as something that goes along with the kind of Thatcher-Reagan era. Maybe you could link it to Chile. Something that has a particular historical specificity to it. And I was thinking about, if you were to ask somebody during this kind of long dawn of neoliberalism, what is going to happen as we become even more privatized and even more commoditized about sex? I think that those people would have predicted the opposite of the outcome that you're diagnosing. I think that they would have said people are going to become more and more exhibitionist. They're going to become more and more voyeuristic. They're going to become more and more likely to try to accumulate, to kind of accumulate personal capital, as you call it, by hypersexualizing themselves. And in particular, I think that they would predict the emergence of a kind of enforced sex positivity, that everybody would be expected to maximally sexualize themselves in order to maximize their, their kind of like personal, their kind of like personal stock portfolio in terms of developing their own brand. So in other words, it could have gone the other way. Like, I think we would have predicted that neoliberalism would have done something else. And I mean, another way of putting it is that the neoliberal self is a maximally plasticized self.
Yeah.
So is that self really traumatizable in the way that you're talking about it? So I just wanted to kind of throw like a curveball at you and see what you made of this idea that maybe neoliberalism is not explaining this as well as we might think it is.
No, that makes sense. Great question. And we'll see if I can hit curveballs. I think
you are from Chicago after all, so
I am. Have you seen the Cubs lately? But anyway, enough sports stuff. I want to respond in a couple ways. I do think actually the sex negativity is tied to certain neoliberal transformations, and I actually see it. Some of this, and again, this is where theorists get to just make shit up on some level. So I didn't like do a survey of my students or anything else like that. But like it's a discourse I often see with my students these days. And I mean, your position about a kind of hypersexuality is what asexual theory is critiquing. And I get it. There is this, I mean, it's a version of what Foucault, argues that rather than sex being repressed, it's ubiquitous and promoted. But I think it's ubiquitous, but it's ubiquitously a problem as I present it. And one of the things I see with my students is that they really have never had an encounter with public space most of the time, and they haven't had an encounter with positions or opinions different from or a world different from the one they lived in. To me, sex is actually about a connection to otherness. It's about a connection, and especially I have a final the last chapter, not the last chapter, the last chapter is about building a sexual and embodied commons. It's probably the most provocative part of the book, but it's also arguing that public sex is important and supporting public sex and making sure it's safe, and producing institutions that can allow it. Sort of building off of Delaney and Jose Munoz and people like that. I argue that that's really important. I do think there's a way in which our sexual images have gotten bigger and more salacious and have become hypersexualized in certain ways. But people's physical relationship to that is usually not about embodied people interacting with each other. It's it's about porn, right, which is ubiquitous. And I'm not anti-porn. I mean, I mean, it's something I also use, sometimes. So, but I do think it's having a complicated effect, like avatar culture itself right now, on how we think about embodiment, that our bodies themselves are now seen as kind of an embarrassment, that they're seen if they're not the kind of hyper image that the culture demands, that then they become this kind of, this sort of aging meat sack that we're dragging around, to use a phrase that Anna uses all the time for her body. So, and I think that's actually a problem. The other thing is that identity has now become so scripted okay, I want to periodize neoliberalism. There was the kind of moment of the growth of neoliberalism as a project that starts in the late 70s, with the Chicago School and Gary Becker, who's actually a really good friend of my mom's, and I'm always like, oh, you're one of the people who destroyed the world. Wonderful. Anyway. It started there at the U of Chicago. It became the doctrine of Reagan and Thatcher, and it was about stripping away the social state, right? It was about stripping away social programs. It was about destroying public space. First slowly and then quickly. It was about private development, public-private development, financial, transformations of urban space. I mean, Delaney talks about this, but it was also a kind of the early part of neoliberalism was also giddy. It was the postmodern years. It was that the idea of everybody having an unbearable lightness of being on a certain level. David Harvey talks about this as a kind of floating quality to early postmodernism, and then post 2008. I think there's a real difference that everything falls back to earth. On a certain level, everything, if everything was lighter than air, everything, to use the quote that, and I'm not doing it right, but anyway, to use the Marx quote, if everything melts into air, then after 2008, and everything seems to collapse back to earth. We want walls, we want borders, we want to keep the other out, we want to keep away from difference or strangeness. Also, because sex itself is actually extimate, it's not something that we have that's tied to it's tied to our egoic self, but in a certain way, it's always other than our egoic self. That's what's so freaky and disturbing about it. It's also what's so rich about it on a certain level, that it actually becomes disruptive of the kinds of ways in which we want to produce an avatar-based sense of self, a self that's perfectly constructed to appeal to to the market, to maybe you'll get the influencer position if you present yourself just right. Maybe you can string together enough gigs in the gig economy to do better than other people. And it becomes so that the idea of actually having sex on a physical level, the idea of actually connecting to people other than yourself feels dangerous, I would argue. And that it feels like a threat. And notice how paranoid so much discourse around sex is. I think neoliberalism is I hope it's dying. And I think we are in the negative second half of it. I would almost compare this to someone like Giovanni Arrighi, who talks about you have a first moment in the world system with whatever the hegemon of the world system is of production and growth, and then the second version is on financialization and trying to maintain a sense of power. I think that's actually happening on a social level now. That people are trying to hang on or present their whatever capital they have, which is really just social capital now, because the real capital's gone elsewhere often. It's gone into finance, among other things. And so there's so I think neoliberalism is real. I think it's had profound, lasting effects on the social. My students, I was just teaching some Langston Hughes and Gwendolyn Brooks and Amari Baraka poems recently, and a number of my students were great with it, but a number of them were like, "Oh, these poems are great. They're about childhood and universal feelings of this," and I'm like, "That's not what these poems are about." I think there's a way, because our culture has become so privatized and so protective of of youth, especially, sex education doesn't exist anymore, basically because of the right-wing sort of transformations around this. People get their sex education from porn, which is not a good place to, whatever you think of porn, that's not the place to get your sex education. It's a staging of fantasies, and often, really kind of like hyperbolic fantasies, and so I actually think that sex is too disruptive. It's too, and maybe this is a kind of psychoanalytic essentialism, but it's too disruptive. It's too scary. It actually feels like it's an imposition on your very carefully manicured sense of self. It's actually easier in some ways to turn on porn than it is to actually, connect with somebody. And open yourself to the otherness of another person. In fact, that otherness feels like an intrusion. And while the trauma is everywhere, there's also, I hear trauma being invoked all the time for just an unpleasant encounter. Or somebody expresses interest in another person sexually, and that's traumatizing or something like that. I mean, and so Trauma's real. I mean, I certainly am not going to negate that. I've been through a lot of trauma, but one of the things I loved being when I was in California was the ways in which there was a kind of ambient sexuality that was just always kind of around, and it feels like what we have now is a sort of fear that sex is going to come and wreck things, whether it's QAnon's fears, right? Whether it's Pizzagate, right? And what's interesting is even real discourses like, Epstein and his pedophile ring, in that case, there is a real pedophile ring, but it's the same discourse, even though it's right. Sex is threatening. It's a danger. You have to watch out for it. I'm not ready to go to a hatred of sex, which is how Tim Dean and I forget the other person who wrote that book, talk about it, but there is, as David Halprin has argued, there is a war on sex in the present, I would argue. You can see it with like the policing of even more and more adult consensual sex and the context in which it can take place. There's a policing around any sex that doesn't fit a kind of normative model. And even as we also want to affirm sexuality, there's also there's also a way in which our understanding of sex is less about desire, I would argue, than it is about identification, and in the present. And so those are all, I actually think all of those are effects of neoliberalism. I think we're leaving neoliberalism. I'm a little scared of what's coming next. I hope it's something like democratic socialism, which is always what my vision is about, and which is why we need both play and structure. The problem with too much old school socialism was it was all about structure without any sense of improvisation, without any sense of and so but what I worry is that this kind of rising fascism, and fascism loves a sex scandal. It will run with it. And so that's one of my worries. There's also Jody Dean's thesis, which I actually don't buy, that there's a kind of neo-feudalism. Again, there's a way in which, the people like Trump are both breaking every kind of law around sex. They're violent. The guy's a rapist. He's a repeated rapist. He's, at the same time, they produce this discourse, like, anti-choice, like, anti-queer rhetorics that actually mark sex as negative. And so that to me is a very feudal formation. Even, I think there's an ideological dimension to a kind of neo-feudalism. I don't buy it on the economic level, but it's the idea that the nobles can do whatever the fuck they want, and the rest of us better watch our back. We better not act out. We better not be too sexual. And so, yeah, there you go.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll chew on it.
We may just disagree on that, and that's cool. So,
Miranda, I wanted to check in with you. I have more questions, but I'm watching time, and I don't want us to go on forever. We've already gone on for a very long time. Maybe I ask one more question, two more questions, or should we just go to something more conversational now? What's your
brain is so happy, so I'm probably not the one to ask.
What if
Craig, you have thoughts? Like we could do a couple more, I think.
Let's actually, I would love it if we could open it up, just because people have put in a lot of time here.
Sure. That's fine. And then if there's
if there's not enough, if we have time, we can come back to the other questions. But your questions have been fantastic. Sorry, I've gone length. It just is, this is yeah.
Well, and also too, if people aren't if people aren't actively jumping in, Donovan, then that's your cue to ask one that you still have remaining.
Gotcha.
Sounds good.